I'd like to take some time to talk about the Tang Dynasty that ruled China from the early 7th century up into the early 10th century AD and was the dominant power in East Asia. The Tang are like the Han Dynasty. They are a period of China in a resurgent, dominant position that is culturally, philosophically, economically influencing not just East Asia, but the entire Eurasian supercontinent. So Eurasia and North Africa are profoundly influenced by the developments that happened during the Tang Dynasty. The Tang are analogous to the Han. They were a dominant, militarily powerful, economically resplendent empire. But like the Han, were preceded by the Qin. The Tang were preceded by the Sui. The Sui dynasty was, like the Qin that preceded the Han, very centralized. It was the result of a period of violent reunification where the Sui dynasty defeated the other states, drove out foreign invaders, and established itself as suzerain over a reunified China. This centralized system also exacted a great toll in taxes and labor over the population. So one of the great construction projects of the Sui dynasty was the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal is the largest canal in human history. It was the most impressive canal up until the development of the Suez and Panama canals in the 19th and 20th centuries. And this canal linked the Yellow River to the Yangtze River in the south. China's two great rivers were linked for water travel for the first time in history, and this dramatically contributed to the pace of development and to the settlement and thorough urbanization of the southern provinces. The Grand Canal is still in use. Ships travel down it every day, and it's a major part of international trade. The chances are that much of what you and I own, it went down the Grand Canal at some point. So the Sui were very influential. But these labor projects took a toll on the health of the population, the morale of the population, and just like with the Qin, with their construction of the Great Wall, the Sui were ultimately destroyed by rebellion. And the Tang are the power that emerged after a brief period of chaos, the end of the Sui. The Tang emerged, reunified China, and reestablished it, building on the power structure created by the Sui. But just like the Han kind of humanized the system created by the Qin, the Tang humanized the system created by the Sui, right, and began to reassert a Confucian worldview, Confucian ethics, and this caused Tang culture to become widespread throughout East Asia. More than any other of the great dynasties, the Tang dynasty was the most outward-looking. It was the one that wanted the greatest economic ties to foreign cultures. It was one that imported many works of art and luxury goods, which is unique in Chinese history because throughout most of Chinese history, it's Chinese art, Chinese culture that is exported outwards. But the Tang were interested in foreign ideas, in foreign practices, foreign cultures. And so this makes the Tang kind of unique. One of the reasons for this is that while they were overwhelmingly Han Chinese, the Tang ruling family did have some Turkish blood. The Turks were a nomadic tribe in Central Asia, similar to the Mongols, who followed around herds of livestock from watering hole to watering hole. And they began to spread from Western Mongolia and lands to the west, Turkestan, into different parts of Asia in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. And the Tang had great relations with many different Turkish tribes, though they were certainly the vast majority culturally, ethnically Chinese. But they were very outward looking. Their city of Chang'an had at its height around 1.5 million people. And so for comparison, Rome, which had around 1 million people in 100 AD, had shrunk to less than 100,000 people by this period of time. Constantinople, the new Rome that had been constructed at the end, well, we say at the end, from the 4th century onward in Roman history. It had around 500,000 people. Baghdad had around 700,000 people. And these were the biggest cities in the world at the time. And of course, we've learned about Angkor Wat and its vast population that will emerge around the same time as Dong Chang'an. But Chang'an is the largest city in the world of its time, and certainly is the most cosmopolitan and sophisticated. You had merchants in Chang'an from all over the world. We know that there were Christian missionaries. You had merchants from the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East. You had a Jewish population in Chang'an. And so really, from the most far-flung portions of Eurasia and Africa, you had people living in the city. So it was truly a world city. And the Dong were militarily dominant over their neighbors, at least before their decline, in a way that even the Han had not been. So this is the first instance of China really flexing its military might far and wide, deep into Central Asia, much deeper than the Han had gone. The Han had dominated Korea, they dominated Vietnam, they dominated portions, the Tarim Basin. The Dong were sending military forces all the way to the Caspian Sea. Right? So they were moving very far west. To understand how this process, I just banged my hand on this object here. Smarts, sorry if that startled you. But to understand the greatness of the Tang Dynasty, we have to start with its founder, the Emperor Gaozi. Gaozi he only reigned for 8 years, but he was extremely influential. Right? He had been a general in the late Sui Dynasty, and during a period of chaos, he reunified the country, stabilized the government, the social system, the economic system, and restored order to China. This was a period in which there was widespread rebellion, there was ruin to the agricultural system, many people were dissatisfied, peasants were abandoning their farms, and Gaozi went to great lengths to make sure that order was restored, productivity was restored throughout the land. So he had begun his career as a military officer, and he was very effective in crushing rebellions. In time, he became alienated from the last Sui emperor, and he himself joined the rebels, ending up taking control of Chang'an. And in 618, he ended up establishing his own dynasty. And the first thing that he had to do is he had to pacify many of the different rebel factions. And instead of simply crushing them violently, he sought to pacify these rebel leaders by winning them over. He gave them titles, he gave them rewards for joining in a coalition underneath him. He also dramatically lowered taxes, which caused peasants to return to their farms, to resume agricultural work. There's a continual pattern we see again and again in Chinese history of the great emperors lowering taxes. Right? Whenever and that's not just because the emperors needed higher taxes during times of strain. The lowering of taxes ensured that the agricultural system would function. And those emperors who understood this, who understood that peasants are not going to break their backs on farms when they're paying you 85% of their produce to the state, right? The more that they got to keep of their own money, the more their net productivity was. And so ultimately, even with a much lower tax rate, the government coffers swelled when peasants could keep more of their output. And he wanted to, just like Liu Bang with the Han, he wanted to maintain the loyalty of the people. He reestablished the governmental bureaucracy, the system of scholar elites governing the provinces, as well as the examination system. So he didn't just act alone. I talked about how he had won over many of the former rebel leaders. He had a number of sons who were very effective as well. One of these, Li Shiming, who would become the Emperor Daizong, who would succeed Gaozi, was very effective in areas where diplomacy had failed and military force was necessary. Li Shimin was absolutely a skilled commander. So Gaozi, his given name was Li Guan. Li, we romanize it as Li, is the second most hallowed surname in Chinese history, with Liu, the founders of the Han Dynasty, being kind of the most hallowed name. Again, if you watch, movies, you watch even action movies from the modern day, the major characters will be named. They'll have the surname of Liu or Li, because these are great heroic surnames. One of the reforms that Gaozi engaged in was mitigating some of the extreme punishments. So, for example, there was a traditional punishment called death by 1,000 cuts. I'm sure you've heard that phrase in the English language. That is a traditional Chinese punishment in which slices of a person are removed, and there's supposed to be 1,000 pieces of flesh removed from a person, and of course you die before this 1,000 are removed. But there's massive blood loss, but it's excruciatingly painful. And what Gaozi did is he stopped this practice, save in the case of patricide or matricide. Remember that this is a Confucian system. Killing your parents or grandparents was the most heinous crime that a person could engage in. So the punishment was maintained for people who engaged in that activity. But people who are found guilty of corruption or who are found guilty of murder, crimes of passion, things like that, they were never punished with death by 1,000 cuts. Death by 1,000 cuts would last into the 20th century even. So, in fact, there are photographs of it. I don't encourage you to go looking for them. Fortunately, by the middle of the 19th century, people began to use strong doses of opium, even enough to cause death to the person who was being sliced open. But nonetheless, Gaozi helped to mitigate a lot of those punishments. He mitigated some of the punishments and some of the work requirements of the sui, so that the peasants owed less corvée labor. They were less exhausted. They were less endangered having to travel. And he was very popular as a result for these changes. Gaozi was succeeded by who was possibly the Dong's greatest emperor, Emperor Tang Dynasty. Daizong had been born Li Shimin. He was instrumental in his father's attempt to pacify the land. He was a very skilled general. Unfortunately for both his father and Emperor Daizong, his father had passed him over for inheritance, despite the fact that he was clearly the most competent of Gaozi's sons. He had great loyalty among the troops. He was a tried and tested battlefield commander who had personally participated in many of the battles that allowed Dong Gaozi to pacify the land. The first decade of Daizong's reign was kind of marked by controversy. A black stain was left on his record due to how he rose through the to the imperial throne. His father had preferred one of his younger brothers. Daizong, then simply General Li Shimin, was not having it. He decided at something called the Xuanwu Gate incident. He ambushed his brothers. He killed one of them, and he basically forced his father to not only accept him as heir, but to abdicate the throne. So he came to the throne via a move against his own father. And this is very controversial in this Confucian society. Ironically, despite the fact that he was criticized for the way he came to the throne, Daizong was one of the most open-minded rulers in Chinese history. Daizong almost relished criticism of his actions, his behaviors. He insisted on not surrounding himself with yes men. He felt that his father had engaged in that kind of behavior, and that it had and that it had caused the initial problem of succession when his father was supported by his advisors in supporting his younger brothers over him. Daizong had an advisor named Wei Zheng, and Wei Zheng is one of the most influential advisors in Chinese history. Wei Zheng was the opposite of a yes man. If we used modern terminology to describe him, he would have been considered, if he lived today, he would be seen as politically incorrect to the extreme. He was very critical. He was critical of Emperor Daizong. He often criticized the policies of the emperor and helped the emperor shape his policies in ways that were more practical and more effective. And he was responsible for the Emperor Daizong actually overthrowing his brother and leading to the abdication of his father. So he wasn't critical of that move, unlike most of the age, but he was very critical of the emperor's policies. And so Daizong praised him for his ability to speak out. He was an excellent scholar. He had risen through the examination system in the Sui Dynasty. He had refused to serve the Sui emperor because the emperor was, he believed the emperor was too harsh against the people. When Daizong came to the throne, he was elevated to a very high imperial rank. Daizong said of him, "Using bronze as a mirror, one can straighten clothes. Using history as a mirror, one can understand rise and fall. Using people as a mirror, one can see one's gains and losses. Wei Zheng was my mirror." So Wei Zheng was the man whom he bounced everything off of. And it's one of the reasons that Tang Daizong's reign is considered one of the greatest ages in Chinese history, and the Tang Dynasty expanded so rapidly. Under Wei Zheng's watch, Tang Daizong repaired many of the institutions that had fallen into disrepair. He changed the examination system. For the first time in history, not only were government officials chosen via examination instead of having been born into noble families, the Tang government actually, there were actually scholarships, system of scholarships that was established so that particularly brilliant children from peasant communities could receive an education and take these exams, which would ensure that the government was always staffed by the most capable men. And this, of course, this was due to Wei Zheng's influence. But the Tang government during its golden age was run by a true meritocracy in comparison to what we see later on. Not only this, the Tang government greatly relaxed taxes, as we've mentioned, greatly relaxed the demands of corvée labor, and the military system that was established by the Tang would go on to become one of the most effective in history. So the Tang military was divided by Daizong into two components. The first component was the Fubing militia system. This was a system akin to the modern American National Guard, in which you have farmers who receive land in exchange for military service. They receive this land, they grow crops from the land, and periodically throughout the year, they undergo military training. When there is an emergency, they will be called up by the state, and they will form the backbone of the Tang military. So you have these kinds of farmer soldiers who transition between productive economic activity and serving the state. And this had a number of advantages. For one, most of these Fubing militiamen served as pikemen, as swordsmen, or as crossbowmen, right? So they're fulfilling the infantry requirements of the military. So they're serving in a kind of broad capacity as the rank and file. But because these men are receiving land from the government, they're extremely loyal to the imperial system. And this would prevent the kind of chaos that we saw at the end of the Han Dynasty, at least during the Golden Age, in which you have these powerful generals who would take control. And now later this changes and almost destroys the Tang Dynasty. But during the Golden Age, the soldiers remain loyal to the government because they're being supported with allotments of land. And of course, because this is their land that they own outright, that they don't pay a significant amount of tax for, because their taxes are coming in the form of their military service, they're keeping the wealth from their land, and they're growing massive amounts of crops. Because they're growing so much food, the threat of starvation declines massively, the population grows, the economy grows, and the state benefits in many different ways. So this is a very effective form of military service. The government can call them into action when they're needed, but the government doesn't pay for them when they're not needed, right? That they're sustained by their own farms. So this will be the infantry arm: the crossbowmen, the pikemen, the swordsmen. Usually in the Dong era, just like with the Han, you had masses of pikemen supported by huge masses of crossbowmen, and also you had units of sword and men equipped with swords and shields to slice through enemy spear formations. But the second wing of the Dong military was the cavalry. And the cavalry, the average rank and file Fubing militiamen could not afford to serve in the cavalry. The cavalry, you had to provide your own horse, your own armor, your own weaponry, but also you had to have the acumen as a rider to be able to fight on horseback. And so this remained the kind of purview of the nobility. So you have a professional standing army of cavalry that were loyal to the emperor, that would serve alongside the Fubing when they were called to the front. And this was very effective because the part of the military that needed constant training and a dedicated system of logistics received it. The part of the military that provided the rank and file was self-sustaining through farming. So this made the Dong a very, very militarily powerful system. The generals remained loyal to the state due to the fact that the rank and file wouldn't follow them into any kind of treasonous activity. And the nobility provided the army with the fighting skill needed to match the horse nomads who lived north and west of the Great Wall. Since the agricultural system had been revitalized and the population was motivated to work hard to produce a very profitable agricultural economy, you start to see massive amounts of exports moving west on the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road had predated to Han times, when Han Wudi began to flex his muscles in Central Asia with the Han military. This Silk Road becomes even more important during the Tang Dynasty, right? So you have, on that map it says Roman Empire. At this point it's the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, that was the major recipient of goods moving west. You have the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East. You have the Byzantine Empire further to the west. And massive amounts of silk, porcelain, and tea begin to move west along this Silk Road. And of course, that means that gold and silver are accumulating inside China, because China is the manufacturing center of the world, right? So as the goods move west, gold and silver moves east. This makes China richer at the expense of the rest of the system. So the empire becomes even more powerful as the government's budget grows and grows and grows through taxing this trade. And not only that, we begin to see Chinese ideas and goods begin to have a massive influence to the West. Now, in the Roman Empire, silk was generally the purview of the nobility and the imperial house. In the Byzantine Empire, the imperial family alone will be allowed to wear silk, not just due to the fact that it's extremely expensive and only they have the wealth to afford it, but due to the fact that it's the prestige attached to Chinese silk is very, very high, and the Byzantine emperors want to maintain that for themselves. And we call this a sumptuary law. Sumptuary laws are laws that forbid certain classes of people from wearing certain clothing or engaging in certain activity. And Chinese goods were at the heart of these sumptuary laws throughout the Middle East and Europe during the early Middle Ages. The Silk Road was able to prosper due to the fact that the Dong had military primacy in Central Asia. The nomadic peoples were scattered, often defeated, forced into tributary relationships with the Dong emperors. And the Dong, because of the fact that They were militarily powerful. There was a great affinity for horses. You see horses in ceramics, horses on relief sculptures on walls, paintings of horses like the one we see here with these Dong court ladies playing polo, which was a sport that originated in the Tang Dynasty and spread west from there. The Dong deeply valued military power and particularly cavalry skill. And so you have lots of art focusing on horses, but also poetry. Some of the greatest poets in Chinese history emerged from this period of time, particularly Li Bai and Du Fu. Li Bai had very light-hearted poetry that many Chinese admirers of Chinese poetry treasure to this day, due to the fact that his lyrics were very playful, very pleasant. But he had originated in his early life. He was kind of a rogue. He was a rowdy young man. He was also a master swordsman, which meant that he would walk around haughty and disrespectful to many people because they couldn't beat him in a duel. He actually ended up with a reputation for kind of licentiousness, like drinking and going to brothels and that kind of thing. But he was a master poet. He actually, according to tradition, now we don't know if this actually happened, but he was so struck by his own reflection. He was a very handsome young man. When he was out on a boat in a lake, he reached over to touch his own reflection, and even though he was a skilled swimmer, he was so drunk that he fell in and drowned. Right? And we don't know if that's true or not, but that's the kind of mythos surrounding Li Bai. Du Fu, the other great poet, was different. He's considered China's greatest poet due to the fact that he kind of represented the soul of the people. Right? He had a great amount of compassion in his poetry, but his poetry was very dour. It was very serious. He was bent on expressing the misery that ordinary people experienced when government was bad. And of course, he came along at a period of time during the An Lushan Rebellion when Dong government was very bad and the Dong Empire was in decline. But artistically, it was a great period because of men like Du Fu who were able to produce these great works of literature. In fact, we read some of them in our source on Yang Guifei. And I'll talk about Yang Guifei more in a moment. So I've already shown some pictures of some ceramics. Landscape painting is something that became very in vogue during the Tang Dynasty. And this is something that originated with the Han and would continue throughout Chinese history. A great emphasis on nature, on landscapes, and this reflected the philosophy of Taoism, which we discussed earlier, a kind of reverence for nature and non-action, right? Observing the peace of nature. And so these paintings became very popular during the Tang period. They're more popular than ever before, and they began to spread throughout Eurasia as a result of the Silk Road. Buddhism also became much more prevalent during the Tang Dynasty. Like landscape painting, it had originated in the Han Dynasty, but it was during the Tang Dynasty where it became widespread to the point that a significant portion of the ordinary population was thoroughly Buddhist. In particular, we see the rise of Mahayana Buddhism. If you remember from our discussion of Indian religions, the sect of Buddhism that relied on bodhisattvas, Buddhist saints, taking people into heaven, into their own personal heavens that they create after their death, so that they can help them to achieve enlightenment in the next life without having to be reincarnated, and then they can achieve nirvana. The bodhisattvas that formed the different sects of Mahayana Buddhism, like Chan Buddhism, which would later would become known as Zen Buddhism in Japan, and Pure Land Buddhism, were very popular, and they inspired the rise of many different monastic institutions, monasteries, and convents. And the government even became concerned because so many people were entering these monasteries and convents. They were not reproducing, they were not farming, they were not engaging in productive activity. And in fact, several times the government cracked down and attempted to successfully to reduce the number of monks and nuns, sending them back into lay life so that they would have families, work, and produce for the state. But during the Tang Dynasty, the government put out its greatest resistance against Buddhism. Early on, Buddhism, men like Wei Zhang looked at Buddhism as a foreign religion that was barbarous. As we know, it came from India, not from China. So the Chinese authorities saw it as a threat to state Confucianism, and there was rivalry with the Taoists. Their great founder Lao Tzu was kind of similar to the Buddha in some of his outlook. So the Taoists looked at Buddhism as a particular threat to their institutions and lobbied the emperor to outlaw the spread of Buddhism throughout the empire. But the empire couldn't contain the spread of Buddhism, and despite the fact that the government was able to crack down on the monasteries and convents, they couldn't reduce the influence of Buddhism in society on a long time frame. And as a result, we see these exquisite statues, some in stone, some cast from different metals, including precious metals, of the different bodhisattvas, from bodhisattvas like Kuan Yin, who, as we see pictured here, who would take you to a Pure Land after your death. And this became very influential from this point on in Chinese history. The Tang period was responsible for a number of scientific innovations that remain with us today. For example, the system of acupuncture, of puncturing at different spots in the nervous system to allow the flow of qi or life force, is something that many people still believe in and practice today. And acupuncture was developed during the Tang period. In addition to this, we start to see the government place special emphasis on sanitation, on hygiene, the establishment of public hospitals for the sick, and all of this would serve to reduce the impact of epidemic diseases. So we start to see, we have, for example, Sun Simiao, one of the greatest doctors in Chinese history, who wrote a very influential work that helped to establish the theory of acupuncture. But not only that, a number of herbal medicines and remedies that are still practiced today. For example, the treatment for alcoholism in traditional Chinese medicine consists of ground up ground up kudzu, rather. I can't believe I said kiwi. Ground up kudzu. I'm from Mississippi, and yet I couldn't have kudzu come to mind. But ground up kudzu is used to prevent the desire for alcohol. And once you drink, supposedly if you've been administering kudzu, it will reduce the desire to continue. And many people swear by it. But these remedies were developed during the Tang period. In addition to this, you had a number of inventions. The woodblock printing press was invented for the first time. So you have Chinese characters that could be arranged on the different woodblocks, and they begin to, it wasn't true movable type yet. The Chinese language didn't at this point lend itself towards movable type, but you could have the same image or text printed over and over and over again, right? So you start to see literacy spread throughout society, and this woodblock printing method began to spread west as well. One of the major innovations from this period of time was gunpowder. Gunpowder is a mixture of charcoal, saltpeter, and sulfur mixed together. It could create an explosive powder. The reason that gunpowder was invented was that Taoist monks were looking for an elixir of immortality. You remember the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, how he was taking mercury in an attempt to become immortal. That belief in an elixir of immortality persisted in Chinese society, and gunpowder was one of the substances that people were planning to consume in order to achieve immortality. However, once its explosive property was observed, it began to be used as fireworks, and then later as rockets. Even as early as the 11th century, Chinese troops were using rockets in battle. And of course, these are not like modern rockets. They're more like bottle rockets, but they still caused great consternation, particularly among the Mongols when they battled the Chinese. So these innovations would spread west and would influence many different societies outside of China. There were a number of engineering innovations. and particularly huge water wheels that could move massive amounts of water and therefore grind grain. We saw advances in metallurgy, where even harder variants of steel would be used, the so-called Damascus steel that would spread west and would be implemented in Damascus in Syria and spread from the Middle East, from throughout the Middle East and into Europe from there, originating in the Tang Dynasty. Clocks were first developed in the Tang Dynasty. You had water clocks, and then later on, you actually have the world's first gear system being created. The Tang government, in addition to printing and clocks and metallurgy, the Tang government maintained the Grand Canal built by the Sui and created a vast network of roads stretching all the way into what's now Afghanistan that were used by merchants and missionaries to carry ideas and goods west. So this is a period of massive expansion in virtually every area of life. Unfortunately, for virtually every society, we have a rise, we also have a fall. And the decline of the Tang Dynasty begins with the Emperor Xuanzong. Xuanzong was a very good emperor throughout his youth and his middle age. He was very attentive, very frugal with the expenditures at court. He attended to concerns in the provinces, and he worked very hard to ensure that the Tang system prospered, continued to prosper, continued to run smoothly. When he became older, though, he began to withdraw from state affairs and focus on life inside the palace. You can see here this image of him with different court ladies and one of his prized mounts. He began to focus on entertaining the many women in his household instead of state affairs, and the empire began to fall into disarray due to his negligence. This is where Yang Guifei enters the picture. Yang Guifei was one of the four great beauties of classical China, and she was a concubine of the Emperor Xuanzong. She had originally belonged to Xuanzong's son, Xuanzong Sar. He had to have her for himself, and he soon became obsessed with her. Now, there was a 35-year age gap between the two. He was 61 when their relationship began. She was 26. She had already been in the household of Prince Shou, Xuanzong's son. And the way that he got her freed from that obligation was he had her briefly become a Taoist nun. So she renounced. That was a way for her to escape her previous obligations. And then after her period of novitiate, where she was a novice but not a fully integrated nun, the same kind of thing exists in Christianity, where you become a novice and then you fully take the habit and make the vows. You have to try out monastic life first before you can commit. When her novitiate was over, he had her brought into his household, and she became his concubine. And he lavished massive amounts of money and attention on her. She really loved lychees, a little sweet fruit that's popular throughout East Asia. If you ever get a chance to try them, they're very tasty. And she loved them, and she had them imported in massive numbers into the palace. In fact, that was part of the poetry. That was I think it was Li Bai who wrote about her love of lychees. How there was a rider riding towards the Tang court, the capital at Chang'an, at breakneck speed to deliver her favorite lychees, her favorite snack. Right? This was the luxury that she was afforded because of the infatuation of the emperor. So Xuanzong began to focus on Yang Guifei and ignore the affairs of state. So the ministers began to complain, revolts began to spread throughout the countryside, and ultimately the emperor lost the confidence of the military, and this would prove absolutely devastating. First off, the emperor would lose access to many of their Central Asian territories after the Battle of Talas in 751. The Abbasid Caliphate, the rising Islamic power in Persia and most of the Middle East, was expanding deep into Central Asia, and they butted heads with the Tang. The Tang were very successful in their initial campaign against the encroaching Abbasid Caliphate, but in 751 The Dong army was defeated, and this effectively checked Dong expansion into Central Asia. Now, the Abbasid Caliphate would learn of certain Dong technological and cultural innovations at this time, particularly papermaking, which would spread into the Middle East and help to fuel a literary renaissance in that part of the world. But the Dong military had been checked. This is in part due to the fact that the empire was militarily overextended. We talked about the Fubing system, in which you had militia who defended the nation on a temporary basis. They received land in exchange for military service. Well, the Dong had by this point largely abandoned the Fubing system, the reason being that they needed full-time troops in far-flung parts of the empire. The empire was simply too large for civilian soldiers, hybrids, to be successful. Right? The farmers had to till their lands. They couldn't be on campaign 365 days a year, which is what was needed to control these far-flung trade posts. The empire had simply expanded beyond what was convenient and efficient, and so the empire became very inefficient due to this expansion, due to its what we would call imperial overstretch. Right? It had too many territories, too many troops in too many places, and no emperor wanted to be the emperor to withdraw or abandon a region. Right? So that was seen as a defeat and a retreat. So the empire continued to overextend themselves. Ultimately, they were overextended to the point that they ended up losing a battle in what's now Turkestan against a very powerful Abbasid opponent. But this wouldn't spell the end of the empire. Certainly, the empire could have bounced back and even avenged their defeat against the Abbasid Caliphate, which was set to decline well before the Tang were finally the dynasty was finally destroyed. But something even more devastating happened. Under the aged Xuanzong, Yang Guifei, his concubine, who had no experience in government, no knowledge of any governmental affairs, no military service, no experience of running a simple farm, was heated on large-scale government projects and endeavors. Her relatives were put into major positions as government ministers, despite the fact that they themselves had little to no experience or expertise in running a massive society of around 60 million people in the 8th century. And Yang Guifei herself was consulted on appointments to various official posts, but also to military positions. This would prove absolutely devastating. There was a general of Turkic ancestry, An Lushan, who was a favorite of Yang Guifei. He was kind of a sycophant who did her bidding. At her insistence, the Emperor Xuanzong appointed An Lushan as a general on the frontier in charge of a very powerful Dong force designed to fight against the horse nomads living beyond the Great Wall. Well, this was a horrible choice. He might have been loyal to Yang Guifei, but he was not loyal to the emperor, and An Lushan rebelled. He launched a massive rebellion. This is the equivalent of a general being put in charge of the 82nd Airborne and revolting against the Dong government, or against the federal government, and other generals joining in. Right? The imperial government struggled to crush this rebellion. It took 8 years, and out of a population of 60 million, the most conservative estimates say that around 13 million people were killed. So 13 out of 60 million, it has been suggested that as many as 36 million people lost their lives as a result of the fighting, or as a result of the famines that stemmed from the fighting. So this is the 8th most destructive war in the history of the world, the An Lushan Rebellion. And it was all sparked by this general who revolted against the Dong government and who only revolted because he was a favorite. He was put into that position as a favorite of the emperor's consort, who was only who had the emperor's ear because of her great beauty. Right? So this is an example of how a monarchy can become mismanaged to such a devastating extent. All this power invested in one autocratic figure, and as a result, his whims, his passions, end up leading the entire empire astray. And the fact that he was one of the best emperors in Chinese history for the first, from early adulthood into middle age, makes this extraordinarily sad, because this effectively, it did not destroy the Tang Dynasty, but it came very close, and it certainly weakened it permanently. An Lushan captured the capital of Chang'an. He destroyed the city. That is correct. The most populous, most sophisticated, wealthiest city in the world was destroyed by this rebellious general. The emperor had to flee. They ended up fleeing southwest into Sichuan, which is the Himalayan foothills. When they were cornered by Tibetan tribesmen, the soldiers had had enough. They had suffered for years fighting for the emperor. The emperor was not leading them to success. They blamed Yang Guifei, and they insisted that the emperor allowed them to put Yang Guifei to death. So he had to sit there idly by in his carriage while they took Yang Guifei out and removed her head, believing her to be the cause of their misfortunes. Xuanzung's successors would revive the empire. They would preserve the Tang Dynasty. They would attempt to rebuild the damage caused by the rebellion. But the empire would never have the vitality that it had previously had. The way out of the crisis from the standpoint of the succeeding emperors was to maintain a system of heavy taxation, which was the opposite of what brought prosperity and would have possibly brought recovery to the population. There was also a great amount of corruption. It was impossible for the emperors to fix every problem at once. But the empire continued to hobble along until it ultimately collapsed. In 907, the last Tang emperor was overthrown, and the dynasty was ended permanently. Unfortunately for China, we're now entering the 10th century, in which there will be a successive wave of short-lived dynasties, followed by barbarian invasions and complete disunity. It will not be until the emergence of the Sung dynasty at the end of the century that we see China revived into a great empire, and unfortunately that empire would not remain united for long due to the massive barbarian invasions from the beyond the Great Wall, and we're going to talk about those when we talk about the Mongol Empire.